This lecture is going to talk about the angiosperm plant body, specifically the structure and function of the stem part of the angiosperm. And remember, angiosperms are just flowering plants like the one you see here. Stems are part of the shoot organ system, and so stem is an organ, and I'm splitting it into three main functions. So supporting and separating the leaves, which is promoting photosynthesis. The second function is to move sugars around the plant body, and that's going from leaves to roots, and moving water and minerals also from roots to leaves. So basically it's the transport and structural system of the plant. The first function of supporting and separating leaves is aided by the primary growth of the stem. So primary growth is growing longer. This allows the stem to get the leaves closer to the sun. And remember, leaves are where the light is captured primarily for photosynthesis, the energy input. So the more sun the plant gets, the more photosynthesis it can do, hypothetically. And so if the plant is taller and the leaves more spread out because the stem is longer, and also more branching, because then you get more sun exposure, and maybe even being taller outcompete the plants that are around you. Primary growth happens both in herbaceous, which are non-woody, like the green, very flexible stems, as well as woody stems in angiosperms. The places where the division occurs and the elongation happens, the primary growth, which we'll see on the next slide, is at these meristem regions. These are marked in purple. On this picture, you'd need to label the things on the exam. So we've got meristems at the tips here, and we've got ones in the little crook of the stem to the leaf attachment. So those are the buds. We also have nodes where the leaves attach. And then the distance between two leaf attachments, or that region between those nodes, is called the internode. And the leaf won't stay on forever, but often if you look at a plant, you can actually see like little scars of where the leaves were at the nodes. And then sometimes you can see the scars in two places, and you can actually still see the internode after the leaves have fallen off. Just like in the root, we call the region of growth the meristem. In shoots, they may also be called the buds. And these are stem cell rich. Stem cells are constantly dividing cells. They self-renew. And these are at the tips of the roots and shoots. And you can see here is the shoot example. We have our apical meristems, or apical bud. That's the one at the apex, which is the tip, like the apex of a mountain. The apex of a mountain is the tip top of it. We also have these axillary buds, not auxiliary. You'll see axillary. They are right at the intersection between where the leaf attaches and the stem. So that little axillary bud is in the crook of those two. And if you've taken anatomy physiology, you may remember that the armpit, or the underarm, is called the axilla. And it's the same idea, of how the structure is formed, right? This would be like the person's body and then their arm, and that's their armpit. It is nothing to do with armpits, but that's the same words. That's why it's called that. And that's the axillary bud. We also have young leaves growing here in that bud region here, because there's the stem cells also allow that too. And you can see this would be the node, which is where the leaf, the new forming leaf, is attached to the stem. Like many processes in plants, primary growth depends on hormones, which are molecules that initiate signaling pathways, often far away from where they are initially made in the organism. Primary growth, there are a number of hormones that are involved in all of these, and most of the time when I say a word like gibberellins, it's actually a group of many molecules that fall underneath that hormone group. So the ones I'm going to want you to know for stems are the gibberellins, that type. They are going to promote the apical meristems, both dividing cells and elongating cells. And so what you can see here is that here's a rosette form of a plant, like I think it's a dwarf form, and they treated it with gibberellins, and you can see this is called bolting when the stems grow really, really long. Sometimes you might hear somebody talking about one of their plants becoming leggy. And so that means that it's just growing really long and tall and not bushy. And we'll see how to alter that in a moment. It is useful for agriculture. These are both the same type of grape, but the one on the right was treated with gibberellins, so it does a number of things. One is it makes the stems elongate, and so when it does that, that means the flowers are further apart, which means that the fruit is further apart. So the stem elongation actually gives more room for the fruit to grow. But also, gibberellins promote not ripening, but fruit growth. It actually makes the grapes bigger too. So that's a very common practice in agriculture, to spray certain types of plants with gibberellins. So we talked about how there are two different types of meristems in the shoot system. We've got the axillary buds, or the axillary meristems, and then those apical buds, or apical meristems. So if both buds are there, both meristems, the apical buds are going to get dominance, meaning they're the ones that grow longer. So that is due to the gibberellins as well as the auxin. Okay, so auxin is a hormone involved in many processes in the plants, and a lot of it's concentration dependent. In this case, what we're looking at is that in the terminal bud, which is this little guy here, auxin is produced there. And so that keeps it growing longer. And it prevents these axillary buds from growing. But if you cut off the tip of the terminal bud, you know, that apical bud, then that allows the axillary buds to grow. So basically, cytokinins are a type of hormone that promote cell division. Cytokinesis is where the name comes from. So once the auxin expression is gone on that tip, then the cytokinins can stimulate those axillary buds, and so then that makes the plant branch and get bushier. So that's why people prune plants. And in the wild, how do plants get pruned? Things eat their tips, like let's say deer or something like that. But when you have a garden, you need to prune it. And so it seems like counterintuitive sometimes to cut a plant in order to make it healthier. Many of them you need to prune or trim off the tips, because then it's going to help those axillary buds to be able to develop and the plant to get bushier, which gives it more structure and often looks a lot better in your yard too. The axillary buds, when they are stimulated, can form a number of structures. If you start paying attention when you look at plants, you'll notice that lots of things grow from that crook next to the leaf. Lateral branches. So you may see a lateral branch and no leaf anymore, but that's because it fell off. So that was at a node. Axillary buds can also grow into flowers. So every flower that you'll see is actually with that leaf junction there. Axillary buds are where thorns grow. And that's how you know a rose does not have thorns, because if you pay attention to a rose, it has the little prickles, what they are, all over the stem. It's not specifically at these axillary bud spots. And remember that all the primary growth is happening from the tips. So plants don't like stretch out, they just add on to the end, which means that wherever the height of this leaf on the plant will always be the exact same height. There's a hole in the tree where an owl lives, and you're a small child, and you come back, 20 years later, and the hole is actually in the same place. In addition to primary growth to get longer, some stems also do secondary growth in order to get wider. This also occurs in some roots, and so gymnosperms do this, and some eudicots, the woody ones, they're going to get thicker. So just like the apical meristems were the ones at the tips making it longer, the lateral meristems are the stem cell populations that are making it wider. These stem cells are arranged in cylinders. So here it looks like it's a cut through, so it looks like a line, but really this wraps all the way around. Here's the same line, and it actually is like a whole ring, right? And it goes all the way up and down. So this is how the newest or the youngest parts of the stem look. As the stem ages, the vascular cambium, the cells there, divide, producing cells to the inside that make new xylem. We call it secondary xylem. Except for that first layer, everything else is secondary xylem. And it produces cells to the outside to make secondary phloem. And the cork cambium is now present, and it's going to be making cells to the outside to make that cork. Here, now this is another year of growth, still the cork cambium, or excuse me, the vascular cambium. And so there's our one round of secondary xylem, which is this. And then here's our next round of secondary xylem. You have the phloem that is also growing to the outside, but the phloem and the epidermis and the cork and all that shed off, actually. So you continue to accumulate these inner xylem rings, and that's what wood is, but the phloem sheds off, so you're not going to get rings and rings of phloem. You just have the active transporting phloem. And here's how the stem cell part works. The C stands for cambium. When a stem cell divides, one of the daughter cells is still a stem cell, and the other one differentiates into a specialized cell. So it divides towards the inside to make a xylem-forming cell, and then that stem cell now divides toward the outside to make a phloem-forming cell. And a new stem cell. Then that new stem cell divides to the inside to make a xylem cell and a new stem cell. Then that new stem cell divides to make a phloem to the outside and a stem cell. And so you can see just back and forth, making it fatter and fatter and fatter. And that's what the rings of a tree are. They are the xylem, the secondary xylem. You can use the width of the tree rings to tell things about the environment that year. And overall, if you look at patterns, you can tell things about climate. A fatter ring is going to mean a warmer, wetter year, and a narrower ring means a dry and or cool year. The bark of a tree is not just the outside, that's just the cork, probably what you thought was bark. But really, it's the cork and the cork cambium, the stem cells there, and also the secondary phloem. Everything from the outside of the vascular cambium, which is why that if you peel bark or you peel the outer layer of the tree away, that can be very damaging because you're taking away the phloem when you take away the bark, not just the cork. And so not only does it expose the tree to pathogens, because remember, plants get sick too, it is also getting rid of their sugar transport system. The majority of the stem is xylem, because like I said, the phloem is shed off the outside. However, not all of that xylem that's in there is actually transporting water and minerals anymore. It's just that kind of most recent layers next to the vascular cambium of that secondary xylem that is transporting. Interior to that, those are called heartwood, which is older and usually full of resins and can be a waste storage. And so you're not actually getting any transport through that center of the tree anymore. Another job of a stem is to be the highway upon or through which molecules are transported. And so one of those molecules is water, goes through the xylem vessels, vasculature, and we know it goes from the root through the stem and all those xylem tubes up. And why does it get pulled out? It gets pulled out because it's leaving through the stoma here, or stomata is plural, which is evaporating into the air. So that's called transpiration. It's all basically through hydrogen bonds. So cohesion between polar water, adhesion between polar water and polar cellulose of the cell wall. And those hydrogen bonds, there's enough of them to really make those water molecules get pulled up the plant through the stem. If I gave you cut throughs That's what these are of a stem. So you cut it and you're looking down at it. You should be able to recognize the eudicot versus monocot. In roots, we talk about the vascular tissue, the xylem and phloem, being in a vascular cylinder, which is right in the middle of the root. Whereas in stems, you can see that the vascular tissue is spread throughout the stem, or at least it can be on the outside, not straight in the middle. And we call them vascular bundles rather than vascular cylinders. And those bundles are scattered around everywhere in a monocot stem. And they're in a ring around the kind of the outside-ish in a eudicot stem. I don't need you to know specifically where the xylem is and where the phloem is and all that kind of stuff. We'll just keep it simple for recognizing monocot, eudicot, and knowing a vascular bundle means the xylem and the phloem. Stems respond to physical forces like light, so phototropism is a response to light, and plants bend towards the light. You'll know that if you've ever put a plant in a window and left it in the same orientation. Eventually it'll be bending towards that window. Interestingly, plants only bend towards certain wavelengths of light though. So the blue wavelength predominantly and somewhat the violet wavelength. But if you just shined red light on a plant, red wavelengths, the plant wouldn't bend towards it. But if you shine blue on there, it would. And the hormone involved in this bending is auxin. And auxin stimulates cells to elongate. And so if you have cells elongating on one side and not on the other, that is going to bend the stems towards the light. So this is positive phototropism. Negative gravitropism, stems grow away from gravity. And thigmotropism is responding to touch. Many stems will grow away from touching something, but not all of them. Some stems, like vines, will grow around that object. That would be positive thigmotropism. Some types of adaptations or modifications of stems are stolons, also known as runners. They are stems that are horizontal and they run along the ground. Usually that's because maybe always, that's because they are putting out new plants. So if you pull this up, and you can do this with grass outside in Houston, find one of those long stringy things in the grass and pull it up. And you'll see that as you do that, it has a lot of tension, and that's because along the whole runner are little rootlets. So there's roots being put down along it, and then you get these little plants growing in those spots, and really it's a form of asexual reproduction. So then the stolon could degenerate, and you'd actually have a whole new plant there. It would be a clone of the parent, but it would be its own new plant. And then there's our rhizomes, which are horizontal as well, but they're under the ground and they're fat. They are also used for lateral growth. So irises, ginger is a classic one. So people talk about ginger root, but that's not right. Ginger is a rhizome stem underground. Tubers are underground storage stems like a potato. A white potato, which is also red potatoes, golden potatoes. Yams are also tubers. Sweet potatoes are roots. Not the same. But white potatoes are tubers. They live, they're underground. Obviously, they're storing starch. There are also stem modifications of defense. So thorns coming out from the axillary buds, like we talked about before, are part of the vascular system. So if they get pulled off, it actually really damages the plant. Unlike a prickle, which is also a modification on a stem, prickles are just epidermal. So basically if you popped off a prickle, it's not going to actually damage the interior tissue of that stem. But both of those thorns and tissues, so here's thorns on I believe it's a type of citrus tree. and prickles are both for defense. Cacti have a lot of different stem modifications. They are all related to not getting dried out and fried in hot and sunny environments or dry environments. Succulents are a broad category of plants that have characteristics that allow them to live in these dry, usually hot environments. So they have these thick, waxy coats on them. So their cuticle is very thick, preventing water evaporation. They also have the ability often to store water. Sometimes it's because they're hollow, but usually it's just because the tissue of the stem has sort of very thick and spongy. As far as water storage goes too, some stems are accordion shaped. So you can see both these type of cacti are accordion shaped. And the reason that matters is because it can expand with water storage. So as the tissue swells with water, it will become less accordion-y. And then when it loses water, it comes back down and becomes more accordion-y. By that I mean like, folded. And that's really very efficient because the plant doesn't have to grow new tissue to get bigger and then shrink and lose the tissue and all that. It just changes the shape. When these plants, like these pokey things here, those are modified leaves. And so these plants here with the spines don't have leaves for photosynthesis, and in fact they have to do photosynthesis with their stems. And so when that happens, we call those cladophylls, the types of stems that do photosynthesis. Classic example are like prickly pear type cacti. Another modification you may see on a stem is having these like white, quote, hair kind of structures. So they can be cooling in kind of two ways. One is that they can reflect the light, and so that keeps the heat energy from getting onto the plant. And they also can help trap water from evaporating and keep that around the plant to keep it cooler there, as well as potentially keeping it kind of in the plant more as well. Economic roles of plants, some economic impacts stems have. Of course, all plant parts, some of them are food. So here's some examples of stem food: asparagus, cinnamon bark, white potatoes, like we mentioned, yams, ginger. Turmeric is also a rhizome. Turmeric is also a rhizome. Maple syrup comes from stems. Sugarcane is also from stems. You can eat bamboo shoots, young bamboo. That's a stem. Economically, we also sell jewelry made of amber, and amber is a fossilized form of resin from the tree. Resin is different than sap. Sap is the fluid that's carrying the sugars through the phloem of the tree. Resin is it's like a semi-solid substance trees secrete when they're damaged to help protect from infection. And so this fossilized amber is very beautiful and highly sought after in jewelry. And amber is actually really nice for finding specimens. I mean, we're talking even very old ones. Well, relatively old for human life, right? Dinosaur age is really not geologically very old. But for us, it gives us a really nice idea of these three-dimensional kind of structures, and the tissue can get preserved. That can be very valuable. Certain medicines, at least or initially from stems, and now we often have synthetic versions of them. And this is why when people talk about, quote, natural things versus synthetic stuff, I mean, in the end, they're all molecules, right? Does it matter that the medicine that's relieving the pain is salicin from willow bark and you're chewing on the willow bark, or it's acetylsalicylic acid in aspirin or pain relievers? willow bark actually has a whole lot of other stuff in it that may or may not be safe, whereas acetylsalicylic acid should have been tested and should be basically just that. On the other hand, maybe there are other things in the willow bark besides the salicin that we wouldn't know that would be helpful. Now, we've done a lot of research on this, and so it's pretty clear that that's the molecule that's doing the pain relieving. So there's advantages and disadvantages, but there is absolutely no intrinsic reason why something made by an organism is in any way better than something made by chemical processes not in an organism. It's all the same. Atoms attached together by bonds. Okay. So this is really important, though, finding the salicin, because acetylsalicylic acid is very important. The aspirin is an extremely important molecule. Cinchona bark, quinine, anti-malaria drug, really important for helping keep malaria down in places with mosquitoes that carry it. One of the very first cancer drugs was called Taxol. And they still use it, but it's very non-specific, so it has a lot of bad side effects. However, when they had nothing, Taxol was, really a big breakthrough, and they found it because it's from Pacific yew bark. Paclitaxel is the molecule there, and they found that basically it prevents cells from dividing when they're in the middle of mitosis. And so that prevents fast dividing cells, like cancer cells, from dividing. Also, it has a lot of side effects, though, because it prevents body cells that are fast dividing from dividing too. You can also make goods from stems, particularly wood stems, so lumber, bamboo. Bamboo is actually a pretty sustainable source of fiber for making things like material, cloth, and using for building. You can get into trouble with bamboo, like if your neighbor plants it and doesn't think about what they're planting, because it does have rhizomes, spreading bamboo. So it can basically invade your yard, and no matter how much you try to get it out, cut it down, it'll just keep coming, growing back, because it's spreading underneath the ground with those horizontal rhizomes. So you have to make sure if you're planting bamboo, plant the clumping bamboo, not the spreading bamboo, so that it stays in one place. That being said, bamboo is low maintenance, not a lot of water involved in growing it. It can grow very quickly, and so that's one of the reasons why it's a nice choice for making products from. There are a lot of other uses for particularly wood products that you could talk about if you're discussing economic roles of stems, and there are plenty of additional economic roles that you might use as well. So that should give you enough information about stems to fill in any notes or packets I give you, and to make sure you understand the learning objectives that are related to stems.